The Zathrian warships appeared in the orbit of New Dakota without any warning. Commander Vex Thor stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the peaceful colony below. The humans had built farms and small cities across the green valleys. They had no military defenses worth mentioning. They were farmers and families who believed the peace treaties would protect them. Vex Thor felt nothing as he gave the order to fire. The first nuclear missiles hit the northern continent at dawn. 17,000 people were sleeping in their homes when the world turned into fire. Some of them had time to reach the emergency shelters. Most did not. The blast waves traveled faster than any warning system could alert them. Children died in their beds. Parents died trying to shield them. The farms that grew food for half the sector burned in atomic fire that reached temperatures hotter than the surface of a star. Vex Thor watched the destruction through his sensors and marked it as a success. The humans needed to learn their place in the galaxy. The Zathrian Confederation had decided that 3 colonies would be enough to make the point clear. Humanity would withdraw from the disputed territories or watch more of their people die. It was simple mathematics and cold strategy. The Zathrians had calculated everything except what would happen next. 2 days passed before the Zathrian fleet reached Port Madison. This colony was larger than New Dakota with 20,000 inhabitants. They had received warnings about what happened to New Dakota. Some tried to evacuate. The Zathrian ships arrived before the transport vessels could leave orbit. Vex Thor gave the same order. The missiles fell. 13,000 people died in the fire. The survivors sent desperate messages into space begging for help that would not arrive in time. The third target was Riverside Station. It was the smallest of the 3 colonies with only 8,000 people. They were miners who extracted rare minerals from the asteroid belt. They had families living in the habitat rings that spun to create artificial gravity. The Zathrians did not bother with nuclear weapons this time. They simply destroyed the habitat rings with their main guns. The people inside died when the air rushed out into the vacuum of space. Some of them survived for almost 2 minutes before the cold and lack of oxygen took them. Vex Thor compiled his reports and sent them back to the Zathrian High Command. 38,000 humans dead across 3 colonies. 0 Zathrian casualties. The operation had been executed perfectly. The High Command broadcast their demands across every communication channel in known space. Humanity would leave the disputed systems immediately. They would pay reparations to the Zathrian Confederation for the cost of the military operation. They would formally acknowledge Zathrian superiority in this sector of space. If humanity refused, then more colonies would burn until they learned to obey. The message reached Earth within hours through faster-than-light communications. It reached the military command centers even faster. Admiral Jacob Kane was in his quarters aboard the UHS Vengeance when his communication console activated with an emergency priority signal. He had been reading reports about minor piracy incidents near the frontier. Those reports suddenly seemed meaningless. He pulled up the casualty lists from New Dakota and read them 3 times. His hands did not shake. His voice did not waver when he called his senior staff to the command center. The safe in his quarters had been installed 20 years ago when he first took command of the 3rd Fleet. Inside was a red envelope marked with 3 black stars. The envelope had been placed there by the Secretary of Defense with instructions that it should only be opened under specific circumstances. Those circumstances were now met. Kane broke the seal and read the single page inside. The order was simple and clear. In the event of an unprovoked attack resulting in more than 5,000 colonial casualties, he was authorized to execute Protocol Crimson Dragon. He had heard rumors about the protocol, but never thought he would see it. Activated in his lifetime, Kane reached for his communications panel and began sending coded messages to every fleet commander in human space. Across the network of military bases and orbital stations, other admirals were opening identical red envelopes. They were reading the same orders. They were beginning the same calculations about how much force would be needed and how quickly it could be deployed. The Zathrians had awakened something that had been sleeping for 200 years. Lieutenant Helen Price arrived at the command center within minutes of receiving the Admiral's summons. She was young for her rank, but she had earned her position through skill rather than connections. She saw the expression on Kane's face and knew that everything had changed. The Admiral's eyes were cold in a way she had never seen before. He gave her orders in a calm voice that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting would have been. She was to send messages to all human colonies instructing them to begin civilian evacuations to the core systems immediately. She was to signal all Third Fleet vessels that leaves were canceled, and full mobilization would begin in 6 hours. On Earth, the President received the same reports that Kane had read. Margaret Cole had been elected on a platform of peaceful expansion and diplomatic solutions. She had spent 4 years building relationships with alien species and promoting trade agreements. She had believed that humanity could find its place in the galaxy without repeating the wars of its past. Now she stood in front of the United Human Assembly and spoke in a voice that carried across billions of screens on hundreds of worlds. She did not make threats. She did not raise her voice. She simply stated the facts with a coldness that made her listeners shiver. 38,000 civilians had been murdered in an unprovoked attack. 3 colonies had been destroyed by an enemy that had signed peace treaties with humanity. The Zathrian Confederation had demanded that humans abandon their homes and pay for the privilege of being attacked. President Cole paused and looked directly into the cameras. She said that humanity had offered the Zathrians peace and friendship. They had offered trade and cultural exchange. The Zathrians had chosen to answer with atomic fire and the screams of dying children. Very well. They would learn what dragons sleep in the human heart. They would learn what happens when those dragons wake up angry. The mobilization began immediately. Every shipyard from Earth to the outer colonies received emergency orders. Production lines that had been building civilian transports were retooled to build warships. Vessels that had been mothballed in orbital graveyards were pulled out of retirement and refitted with weapon systems that had been kept in storage for decades. Military personnel who had retired to civilian life received recall notices. Factories that made consumer goods switched to producing missiles and ammunition. The entire industrial capacity of human civilization began turning toward a single purpose. Captain Ryan Foster received his orders while he was visiting his sister on Mars. He had been on leave for 2 weeks. The recall notice terminated his leave immediately and ordered him to report to the orbital dock where the UHS Retribution was being brought back into service. The Retribution was a heavy cruiser that had been in reserve for 15 years. Foster had commanded her during the last piracy suppression campaign before she was mothballed. Now she was being loaded with enough missiles to destroy a small moon. He arrived at the dock to find his old crew already assembling. Many of them had been recalled from civilian jobs. All of them looked grim and determined. The news networks across human space showed images of the destroyed colonies. New Dakota was a smoking crater. Port Madison was a field of rubble. Riverside Station was debris floating in space. The networks interviewed survivors who had managed to escape. They told stories of children who had been vaporized in their schools. They described parents who had died shielding their families from the blast waves. They showed footage of rescue workers finding bodies in the ruins. The anger spread across human civilization like wildfire. The shipyards around Earth worked without stopping. The workers ran triple shifts and slept in temporary quarters near the construction docks. Massive vessels that had been collecting dust in orbital storage were towed into the yards and stripped down to their frames. Engineers installed new weapon systems that had been developed in secret research facilities. The missiles being loaded onto the warships were more powerful than anything the galaxy had seen in 3 generations. The railguns could fire slugs at speeds that approached a significant fraction of light speed. The energy weapons drew power from reactors that could light up an entire city. Captain Ryan Foster stood on the bridge of the UHS Retribution and watched the supply shuttles make their final runs. His ship had been dead metal floating in space 72 hours ago. Now every system was online and ready for combat. His crew had worked without rest to bring the vessel back to life. Commander Lisa Grant stood beside him looking at the tactical displays. She had been his executive officer during their last tour together. She had left the military to teach at the Naval Academy. The recall order had pulled her back into service. Foster had lost a cousin on New Dakota. The woman had been a teacher at a small school in the farming district. She had died trying to get her students into the emergency shelter. Only 3 of the I.M. had made it. Grant had lost a childhood friend on Port Madison. The stories were the same across the entire fleet. Nearly everyone wore a black armband for someone they had known. The anger was personal now. This was not just another military operation. This was revenge for murdered families. The Zathrian Confederation celebrated their victory with military parades in their capital city. The news networks on Zath Prime showed crowds cheering for the returning fleet. Military analysts appeared on talk shows to discuss how quickly the humans would surrender. They had studied human history and found a species that preferred negotiation over warfare. The humans had fought small wars against pirates and insurgents, but nothing on a large scale. The analysts predicted that humanity would withdraw from the disputed systems within 2 weeks. Some suggested the humans might even dissolve their military entirely, as a gesture of submission. Commander Vex Thor was promoted to High Admiral for his successful operation. He gave interviews where he described the attacks in clinical detail. He spoke about the precision of the strikes and the efficiency of the kill ratios. He never mentioned the civilians by name. To him, they were simply numbers in a report. The Zathrian government issued statements saying the attacks had been necessary to establish proper boundaries in space. They claimed the humans had been encroaching on Zathrian territory for years. The murdered colonists were described as acceptable casualties in a territorial dispute. Ambassador Eric Shaw sat in the Galactic Council chambers and listened to 3 days of emergency debates. The Palaxians called for economic sanctions against the Zathrians. The Varath suggested establishing a neutral zone between human and Zathrian space. The Minbari offered to mediate peace talks. The Zathrians sent a junior diplomat who repeated their demands that humanity surrender the disputed territories. Shaw said nothing during any of the sessions. He simply took notes and watched the other species argue about appropriate responses. On the 4th day, a young Zathrian attaché approached Shaw in one of the private corridors. The alien seemed nervous and kept looking around to make sure they were alone. He asked Shaw if the human government would see reason and accept the Zathrian demands. Surely humanity understood that more colonies would be destroyed if they resisted. The war could be over in days if the humans simply agreed to withdraw. Shaw looked at the young alien with an expression that might have been pity or contempt or both. Shaw asked the Zathrian if he had studied human history. The alien replied that humans rarely went to war and preferred diplomatic solutions. Shaw corrected him with a cold smile. Humans preferred peace when peace was possible. But when humans did go to war, they preferred to make sure they never had to fight the same enemy twice. The Zathrian did not understand what that meant. He would learn soon enough along with the rest of his species. By the end of the first week, the human fleet had assembled at rally points across their territory. The 3rd Fleet gathered near the frontier under Admiral Kane's command. The 1st Fleet moved into position under Admiral Christine Wells. The 2nd Fleet deployed with Admiral Paul Torres leading from his flagship. The 4th and 5th Fleets took up supporting positions. Nearly 800 warships ranging from massive dreadnoughts to swift destroyers formed the largest military force humanity had ever deployed. Admiral Kane stood in the command center of the UHS Vengeance and studied the tactical display showing the entire armada. The fleet stretched across thousands of kilometers of space. Each vessel carried enough firepower to level a city. Together they could crack planets. Admiral Wells and Admiral Torres joined him via secure communication links. Their faces appeared on screens showing them standing on their own flagships. Wells mentioned that the Galactic Council was calling for restraint. 3 different species had offered to mediate between humanity and the Zathrians. Kane told them to inform the Council that humanity would be happy to negotiate once the Zathrian military no longer existed as a fighting force. Wells raised an eyebrow at that statement but did not argue. Torres asked about rules of engagement. Kane's response was simple. They would destroy every Zathrian military installation, shipyard, and fleet base. They would hunt down every warship that had participated in the colony attacks. They would continue until the Zathrians no longer had the capacity to threaten human civilians. There would be no warnings and no second chances. A young ensign named Danny Carter worked in the fleet communications section. His job was to monitor broadcasts from Zathrian space and compile intelligence reports. He had been listening to their news network since the attacks began. On the 8th day after the attacks, he noticed something different in the Zathrian broadcasts. They had stopped talking about human weakness and started talking about human fleet movements. Their military analysts had finally realized how many ships humanity was deploying toward their borders. Carter brought his findings to Admiral Kane during the evening briefing. The Zathrian news networks were showing sensor data of human fleet positions. Their analysts were calling the deployment an overreaction. Some were suggesting the humans were bluffing and would turn back before entering Zathrian space. Others were less certain. A few voices were beginning to express concern about the size of the human response. Kane listened to the reports and smiled without any warmth in the expression. The Admiral told Carter that the Zathrians had not seen humanity react yet. What they were seeing now was just the preparation. The actual reaction would begin when the fleet crossed into Zathrian territory. Kane dismissed the briefing and returned to his quarters. He sat alone for an hour looking at the casualty reports from the 3 colonies. 38,000 names, 38,000 people who had trusted the peace treaties to protect them. They had been wrong. The treaties had been worthless. The only thing that would protect human civilians now was making sure no one ever dared to attack them again. Captain Jenny Moore commanded the destroyer UHS Swift Retribution. She had named the vessel herself when it was commissioned 5 years ago. At the time, she had thought the name was dramatic and imposing. Now it felt appropriate. Her crew was young and many of them had never seen combat. She gathered them in the main hangar bay and spoke to them about what was coming. She told them they were going to war against an enemy that had murdered children in their sleep. She told them the Zathrians had believed humans were weak and cowardly. They were going to learn the truth. Moore's tactical officer was a lieutenant named Kevin Brooks. He had graduated from the academy 2 years ago at the top of his class. He had expected to spend his career on patrol missions and anti-piracy operations. Instead, he was preparing for the largest fleet engagement in human history. He asked Moore if she thought the Zathrians understood what was about to happen to them. Moore shook her head. The Zathrians had calculated everything based on old assumptions about human nature. They had studied wars that happened centuries ago. They did not understand that humanity had been building weapons in secret for 200 years. They did not understand that humans protected their children with a ferocity that could burn worlds. The final supply ships departed from the fleet anchorages. The last shore leave ended. The last messages to families were sent. Admiral Kane gave the order to all fleet commanders. They would enter Zathrian space in 12 hours. The rules of engagement were clear. Destroy all military targets. Avoid civilian casualties when possible. But mission success was the priority. The Zathrians had started this war with atomic fire. Humanity would end it with something far worse. The human fleet crossed into Zathrian space like a storm front moving across a clear sky. There were no final warnings broadcast. There were no diplomatic messages sent. There were no demands for surrender or offers of negotiation. The fleet simply appeared at the border and began moving deeper into enemy territory with weapons armed and shields raised. Every captain had their orders. Every crew knew their target. The time for talking had ended before it even began. The first battle happened at a mining colony called Zexnor 7. The colony itself was civilian, but it was protected by a defense fleet of 12 warships. The Zathrian commander was a veteran officer named Kexitar, who had fought in border skirmishes against pirates. He had 40 years of experience and 3 commendations for valor. His sensor operators detected the human ships approaching from the edge of the system. Kexitar studied the readings and felt confident. He had 12 warships against what appeared to be 30 human vessels. The odds were not ideal, but they were acceptable for a defensive engagement. Admiral Paul Torres commanded the human attack force from the bridge of the UHS Righteous Fury. His dreadnought led a formation that included 2 heavy cruisers, 5 destroyers, and 20 support vessels. They advanced toward the Zathrian defensive line at a steady pace. Torres watched the enemy ships move into their combat formation. They were positioning themselves well. Their fleet doctrine was sound. It would not matter. Torres gave a simple order to all ships in his group. Weapons free. Engage at will. The space between the 2 fleets lit up with missile trails and energy beams. The Zathrians fired first and their weapons were effective. Human shields absorbed most of the damage, but some shots got through. A destroyer took a hit that knocked out its port weapons array. A cruiser lost its forward sensors to a well-placed energy beam. The Zathrian ships pressed their advantage and moved closer to exploit the damage they had caused. Then the human fleet opened fire with their full arsenal. The missiles that streaked across the void were faster and more numerous than anything the Zathrians had expected. Their point defense systems tried to intercept, but there were too many targets coming too fast. Explosions rippled across Zathrian shields. The first ship lost its shields within 30 seconds. The second ship followed 10 seconds later. The Zathrian formation began to break apart as captains realized they were outmatched. The human railguns fired next. The weapons accelerated metal slugs to incredible velocities using magnetic fields. The slugs crossed the distance between the fleets in less than 2 seconds. When they hit Zathrian armor, the impacts released kinetic energy equivalent to small nuclear weapons. Hull plating crumpled, internal compartments decompressed, power systems overloaded. One Zathrian cruiser simply came apart in the middle as a railgun slug passed completely through it from bow to stern. The energy weapons were the final touch. Human beam weapons had been developed in secret research facilities for decades. They drew power from antimatter reactors that generated more energy than most planetary power grids. When the beams struck Zathrian vessels, the armor did not just break. It vaporized. Entire sections of ship disappeared in flashes of superheated plasma. The Zathrian ships tried to return fire, but their targeting systems could not keep up with the speed of human weapons. The battle lasted 9 minutes from first shot to last. All 12 Zathrian warships were destroyed. The human fleet suffered minor damage to 3 destroyers and 1 cruiser. No human ships were lost. Captain Jenny Moore watched the tactical display from the bridge of the Swift Retribution. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Kevin Brooks, stared at his screen with an expression of shock. He asked if they had really just won that easily. Moore understood his confusion. She explained that the Zathrians had been at peace for 3 generations. They had not fought a major war in living memory. Humanity had been preparing for war for 2 centuries. There was a difference between a military that trained for peace and a military that prepared for violence. The news of the battle reached Zath Prime within hours. The High Command scrambled to respond. They pulled warships from patrol routes, border stations, and escort duties across their entire territory. Fleet commanders received emergency orders to converge on the fortress world of Carthan. The planet was the key to their defensive strategy. It was ringed with orbital defense platforms and protected by the largest concentration of warships in the Zathrian military. If the humans could be stopped anywhere, it would be at Carthan. The Zathrian High Command assembled 40 warships at Carthan, along with 36 defense platforms. The platforms were massive structures armed with long-range missiles and heavy energy weapons. They had shields powerful enough to withstand sustained bombardment. The Zathrians had spent 50 years building the defenses around Carthan. They believed the fortress world was impregnable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Admiral Jacob Kane reviewed the intelligence reports about Carthan with his senior staff. The fortress world was indeed well defended. The orbital platforms had significant firepower. A direct assault would be costly in terms of ships and lives. Commander Frank Hayes suggested bypassing Carthan entirely. They could strike at other Zathrian colonies and force the enemy to spread their forces thin. Kane rejected the suggestion immediately. He explained that every day the war continued was another day human colonists lived in fear. They needed to end this quickly and decisively. That meant going through Carthan rather than around it. The human fleet gathered at the edge of the Carthan system. They did not rush in. Instead, they spent 6 hours deploying their full strength in a careful formation. Dreadnoughts took position at the center. Carriers deployed their fighter wings. Cruisers and destroyers formed screening elements. Behind the main battle fleet came the siege platforms. These were massive mobile weapons emplacements that humanity had built specifically for this kind of assault. Each siege platform was the size of a small moon and carried weapons that violated 3 different galactic treaties. Fleet leader Dax Moore commanded the Zathrian Defense Force. He was one of the most respected officers in the military with a career spanning 5 decades. He watched the human fleet deploy at the system's edge and felt his confidence begin to waver. His intelligence reports had said the humans would bring 30 ships. His sensors showed 300. He opened a channel to all defense platforms and fleet vessels. They would hold at Carthan. They would make the humans pay for every meter of space. They would show the galaxy that the Zathrian military could not be defeated by overwhelming numbers alone. The human fleet advanced in perfect formation. The Zathrians opened fire at maximum range. Their missiles streaked across millions of kilometers of space. Their energy weapons reached out to touch human shields with beams of concentrated energy. The defense platforms unleashed devastating barrages that lit up the darkness with artificial stars. Human destroyers took damage. One cruiser had to fall back with its engines damaged. The Zathrians fought with skill and determination. They destroyed 6 human destroyers completely. They crippled a heavy cruiser. For a moment it seemed like the defenses might hold, Then the human siege platforms fired. Each platform carried weapons that should not have existed. Antimatter missiles that released the energy of matter-antimatter annihilation. Quantum disruptor beams that tore apart the fundamental bonds between atoms. Graviton hammers that could crack planetary crusts. The weapons had been developed in deep space research stations where no one could see what humanity was building. They had been kept secret for exactly this moment. The first defense platform disappeared in an expanding sphere of plasma. The second lost its shields and then its structure. The third broke in half and tumbled into Carthan's atmosphere. Within minutes, the entire defensive network was gone. The Zathrian fleet tried to retreat, but human fighters and bombers had already cut off the escape routes. The carriers had launched their strike craft during the initial engagement. Now those small, fast ships swarmed through the Zathrian formation like predators hunting wounded prey. Admiral Kane watched the battle from the command center of the Vengeance. He felt no joy in the destruction, no satisfaction in the victory, only a cold determination to end the war before it consumed any more lives. Lieutenant Helen Price reported that the Zathrian flagship was sending a transmission. They were requesting terms of surrender. Kane's response was immediate and cold. Denied. The Zathrians had asked for war when they burned human colonies. Now they had war. There would be no mercy until every Zathrian military asset was destroyed. The battle for Carthan ended with the Zathrian fleet completely destroyed. Not a single enemy warship remained operational in the system. The planet itself was defenseless. Kane stood looking at the blue-green world on his main display. 2 billion Zathrians lived on that planet. They were civilians. They were families. They were children who had nothing to do with the decisions their government had made. Commander Hayes asked quietly what they should do about the planet. Kane gave his orders. Maintain blockade positions. No orbital bombardment. Humanity would not repeat the crimes of their enemy. The war continued for 3 more months, but the outcome was never in doubt after Carthan fell. Human fleets swept through Zathrian space like a force of nature that could not be stopped or reasoned with. Every military installation was found and destroyed. Every shipyard that built warships was reduced to wreckage. Every fleet base was hit by human bombers until nothing remained but debris in orbit. The Zathrian military tried to regroup and mount defensive operations, but they were always one step behind the human advance. Their commanders could not predict where the next attack would come from. Their intelligence networks had been blinded by human electronic warfare. Their supply lines were cut by human raiders who appeared without warning and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Admiral Christine Wells led the First Fleet in a campaign that destroyed the Zathrian 2nd Defense Group. The battle took place near a gas giant where the Zathrians had built refueling stations for their warships. Wells brought 80 vessels against a Zathrian force of 30 ships. The enemy fought well and managed to destroy 4 human destroyers before being overwhelmed. The refueling stations were left intact, but their military components were removed. Human boarding teams swept through the stations and pulled out every weapon system and military computer. The civilian workers were allowed to leave on evacuation ships. Wells watched them go and felt nothing but cold satisfaction that the Zathrians were finally learning what it meant to be helpless. Admiral Paul Torres hunted down the remnants of the Zathrian Third Fleet across 6 different systems. The enemy commander was skilled and kept his forces moving to avoid being pinned down. Torres pursued them for 5 weeks before finally cornering them near an asteroid field. The battle was brief and one-sided. The Zathrian ships were low on ammunition, and their crews were exhausted from constant running. They surrendered after losing half their force. Torres accepted the surrender and took the surviving crews as prisoners of war. He made sure they were treated according to military law. They received medical care and adequate food. They were not tortured or mistreated, but they were also not released. They would remain prisoners until the war ended. On Earth, President Margaret Cole held daily briefings with her military advisors and cabinet members. The reports from the front were always the same. Another victory. Another Zathrian fleet destroyed. Another military installation reduced to ruins. Minimal human casualties. Complete tactical success. The president listened to these reports with a grim expression. She had authorized the war and she would see it through to the end, but she took no pleasure in the destruction. She knew that every Zathrian ship destroyed meant hundreds of lives lost. She knew that many of those lives belonged to people who had simply been following orders from their government. Secretary of State Gregory Palmer brought news that the Zathrian civilian government was requesting peace negotiations. They claimed that the military had acted without proper authorization from the civilian leadership. They said the attacks on human colonies had been the decision of rogue officers. They promised that those responsible would be punished if humanity would agree to stop the offensive. Palmer presented this information to the president and waited for her response. Cole read through the diplomatic messages and the intelligence reports that proved the civilian government had approved every step of the military operation. She looked at Palmer and told him the truth. The Zathrians were lying. They were only sorry they had lost. The president authorized peace negotiations, but only on humanity's terms. Ambassador Eric Shaw was chosen to lead the human delegation. He had spent the war watching the Galactic Council debate appropriate responses, while human fleets destroyed the Zathrian military. Now he would represent humanity at the peace table. Shaw traveled to a neutral station in Palaxian space where the negotiations would take place. The Zathrians sent a delegation led by civilian director Torvan. The alien politician had held no military rank during the war. He claimed to represent a reformed government that wanted nothing more than peace and reconciliation. The first negotiating session took place in a conference room with representatives from several neutral species observing. Torvan began with a long speech about the tragedy of war and the need for both sides to move forward. He spoke about healing and forgiveness. He suggested that humanity and the Zathrian Confederation could build a better future together if they simply put the past behind them. Shaw listened to the entire speech without interrupting. When Torvan finished, Shaw placed a datapad on the conference table and slid it across to the Zathrian delegation. Torvan picked up the pad and began reading the human terms. His face changed color as he went through each line. Complete demilitarization of all Zathrian forces. Human occupation of key systems for a period of no less than 20 years. Reparations to be paid to the families of those killed in the colony attacks. The reparations would continue for 50 years. War crimes trials for every officer involved in planning or executing the attacks. Restrictions on Zathrian industrial capacity to prevent rebuilding of military forces. Creation of a neutral zone between human and Zathrian space. The terms went on for 12 pages. Torvan looked up from the datapad with an expression of shock. He said these terms would reduce the Zathrian Confederation to a vassal state. They would cripple the economy. They would humiliate an entire species. Surely Ambassador Shaw could not be serious. These terms were too harsh. They were unreasonable. Shaw looked at the Zathrian director with cold eyes. He corrected Torvan with a voice that carried across the conference room. These terms would allow the Zathrian species to survive. That was more mercy than they had shown to human colonists. The Zathrians had wanted to awaken the dragon. They should be grateful that humanity was choosing to let them live in the dragon's shadow, rather than burn them to ash. The negotiations continued for 2 weeks. The Zathrians tried to bargain for better terms. They argued that some of the restrictions were too severe. They claimed they could not pay the reparations without destroying their economy. Shaw listened to every argument and rejected every request for modifications. The terms were non-negotiable. The Zathrians could accept them, or the war would continue until their civilization ceased to exist as a functioning entity. On the final day of negotiations, Torvan signed the treaty. He did so with shaking hands and tears in his eyes. The Zathrian Confederation had ceased to be an independent power. They would exist only at humanity's discretion. The Galactic Council watched the peace treaty with growing concern. Many species thought the human terms were too harsh. The Vorath ambassador approached Shaw privately after the signing ceremony. The alien diplomat said that humanity was being too severe. Such harsh terms would create resentment that would lead to future conflicts. The Zathrians would never forgive this humiliation. Shaw turned to face the Vorath with an expression that showed no sympathy. He asked if the Vorath knew what happened to the last species that attacked human civilians on this scale. The Vorath admitted there had never been such an attack before. Shaw nodded. The Zathrians were the first. They had wanted to make an example of humanity. Instead, they had become an example for the entire galaxy. The Vorath asked what kind of example. Shaw explained that the Zathrians would serve as a permanent reminder of what happens when someone mistakes human kindness for human weakness. Every species in the galaxy would look at the broken Zathrian Confederation and remember that humanity preferred peace, but was capable of total war. They would remember that attacking human civilians was not a political strategy, but a death sentence for any military that tried it. The lesson would be written in the ruins of Zathrian shipyards and the ashes of their fleet bases. Back, aboard the UHS Vengeance, Admiral Kane gathered his senior officers for a final meeting before the fleet returned to human space. Captain Ryan Foster was there along with Admiral Christine Wells and Commander Frank Hayes. Dozens of other officers who had fought through the entire campaign attended, either in person or via communication links. Kane stood before them and spoke about what they had accomplished. They had protected human colonies. They had destroyed an enemy that had murdered civilians. They had sent a message to the galaxy that humanity could not be attacked without consequences. Kane also spoke about the cost. They had lost ships and crews during the campaign. Good people had died fighting this war. Every Zathrian ship they destroyed had people aboard. Those people had families who would mourn them. War was necessary sometimes, but it was never good. They had been dragons when they needed to be. Now they needed to remember they were also human. Captain Jenny Moore raised her hand and asked if the Admiral was saying they had been wrong to fight. Kane shook his head. They had been right to defend their people. Being right did not make it easier to live with what they had done. They would all carry the memories of this war for the rest of their lives. 5 years passed after the war ended, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The human fleet returned to peacetime operations, but every species knew that the dragons still existed. They slept in orbital shipyards and deep space stations. They waited in the hulls of warships that patrolled the borders of human space. They were always watching, and they would wake again if needed. The lesson had been taught, and the galaxy had learned it well. Admiral Jacob Kane retired from active duty 2 years after the treaty was signed. He spent his retirement on Earth, but he traveled occasionally to visit the memorials that had been built on the colony worlds. On the 5th anniversary of the attacks, he stood at the memorial on New Dakota. The colony had been rebuilt with help from across human space. New farms covered the valleys. New cities rose where the old ones had burned. But the monument to the dead remained as a reminder of what had been lost. 17,000 names were carved into black stone that reflected the light of the system's sun. A young woman in the uniform of the Colonial Defense Force approached Kane as he stood reading the names. She introduced herself as Amy Collins. Her family had died in the attacks. Her parents and 2 younger brothers had been at home when the missiles fell. She had survived only because she was away at university on another world. She told Kane that she wanted to thank him. He had made sure her family did not die for nothing. The Zathrians had been punished. Human colonies were safe now because of what the fleet had done. Kane listened to her words and felt the weight of them. He told Amy that he was sorry he could not save her family. He was sorry that the fleet had not been there when it mattered most. Amy shook her head and said he was wrong. The fleet had been there when humanity needed it most. The Zathrians had thought humans were weak and would not fight back. Kane had shown them the truth. He had shown the entire galaxy that humanity would protect its people no matter the cost. On Zath Prime, the rebuilding continued under the supervision of human peacekeeping forces. Commander Tony Blake oversaw the occupation with a firm but fair approach. His soldiers maintained order, but they also helped rebuild infrastructure. Human engineers worked alongside Zathrian construction crews to repair power grids and water systems. Human medical teams provided care in hospitals that had been damaged during the war. The occupation was not meant to be permanent, but it would continue until humanity was certain the Zathrians no longer posed a threat. A Zathrian teacher named Pelman taught history at a school that had been rebuilt with human assistance. She approached Commander Blake one afternoon as he inspected a new community center. She asked him a question that had been bothering her. Why had humanity not destroyed the Zathrian species completely? After what her people had done, the humans would have been justified in reducing every Zathrian world to ash. They had the weapons and the power to do it. Why had they shown mercy? Blake considered his answer carefully. He explained that destruction was easy. Any species with enough weapons could destroy another civilization. Building something better was hard. Humanity wanted to make sure the war never happened again. That meant holding the Zathrians accountable, but not punishing them forever. It meant teaching them to be better rather than simply eliminating them. Pelman asked if that meant humanity had punished her people. Blake nodded. The Zathrians had been held accountable for their crimes. There was a difference between accountability and eternal vengeance. At the Galactic Council, humanity now held a permanent seat with veto power over major decisions. Ambassador Eric Shaw had been promoted to Director of Human Diplomatic Relations. He spent his days ensuring that the lessons of the war were not forgotten. The other species watched humanity with a mixture of respect and fear. The humans had proven they could be ruthless when necessary, but they had also shown restraint. They had not exterminated the Zathrians. They had not conquered neutral worlds. They had simply removed a threat and then returned to peaceful trade and diplomacy. The Palaxian ambassador spoke with Shaw after a council session about trade regulations. The alien diplomat mentioned that humanity had fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Shaw agreed, but pointed out that humanity had not wanted this change. Humans had wanted to be partners and friends with other species. They had wanted to explore the galaxy and learn from alien cultures. The Zathrians had forced humanity to reveal the darker side of their nature. Now every species understood that human kindness came with human strength backing it. On Earth, President Margaret Cole served out her final term and then retired from politics. She had led humanity through its darkest hour and its greatest military victory. Her final address to the United Human Assembly was watched by billions across human space. She stood at the podium with the new flag behind her. The flag showed a dragon coiled around a peaceful Earth. It had become the symbol of humanity's new position in the galaxy. Cole spoke about the war and what it had cost. She reminded everyone that humanity had not chosen the conflict. It had been forced upon them by an enemy that saw compassion as weakness. The Zathrians had paid a terrible price for their mistake, but humanity had also paid a price. They had lost their innocence. They had lost the belief that the galaxy would accept them as they wished to be seen. They had learned that peace must be defended by those willing to fight for it. The president explained that humanity was still the same species they had been before the war. They still valued peace and cooperation. They still wanted to explore and learn, but they were no longer naive. They understood now that some species only respected strength. The dragons would continue to sleep, but they would always be watching. They would wake again if anyone threatened human colonies or human civilians. The lesson had been taught in fire and blood. It would not need to be taught again. In the years that followed, humanity became known throughout the galaxy by their new reputation. They were fair in their diplomatic dealings, but they never backed down from threats. They were generous in trade, but they protected their interests. They were peaceful, but everyone remembered what happened when that peace was broken. Young species entering the galactic community would eventually ask about the Zathrian Confederation. They would wonder how such a powerful empire had been reduced to a shadow of its former glory. The answer was always the same across every species and every world. The Zathrians had bombed human colonies. They had murdered civilians to make a political point. They had awakened the dragons, and dragons once awakened were never forgotten. The story became a legend that parents told their children. The legend became a warning that diplomats shared with aggressive species. Do not threaten human civilians. Do not attack human colonies. Do not mistake their preference for peace as an inability to wage war. Admiral Kane lived to see the 10th anniversary of the war's end. He traveled to New Dakota for the memorial ceremony, along with other surviving senior officers. Captain Ryan Foster was there. He had been promoted to admiral and now commanded the reformed Third Fleet. Captain Jenny Moore attended as well. She commanded a carrier group that patrolled the borders of human space. Lieutenant Helen Price had become a commander and served as executive officer on a heavy cruiser. They all wore their dress uniforms with the medals and ribbons they had earned during the war. The ceremony began at dawn. The names of all 38,000 dead were read aloud one by one. It took 6 hours to read every name. The survivors and families of the dead stood in silence and listened. When the reading finished, Kane stepped forward to speak. He was an old man now with white hair and a body worn down by age, but his voice was still strong and his words carried across the assembled crowd. Kane said they remembered the dead not because of how they died, but because of what their deaths had meant. They had been murdered to make a point. Instead, their sacrifice had awakened something in humanity that had slept for generations. Humanity had become dragons to avenge them. Humanity remained dragons to protect those who came after them. But humans were also still human. They remembered mercy alongside justice. They rebuilt alongside retribution. They hoped that the galaxy had learned the same lessons humanity had learned. Kane looked out at the rebuilt colony. He saw children playing in parks that had once been craters. He saw farms growing where nuclear fire had burned the earth. He saw a future that the murdered colonists would never live to see. He said that peace was not weakness. Peace was only possible when backed by strength. The dragons would stand guard so that no other human colony would ever burn. The message had been sent across the galaxy in a language that every species understood. The crowd stood in silence when Kane finished speaking. Then slowly one person began to applaud. Others joined in until the entire assembly was clapping. They were not applauding war or violence. They were applauding survival. They were applauding the promise that humanity would never again allow its people to be slaughtered without consequence. They were applauding the dragons that slept in human hearts and human shipyards. Across the galaxy, the lesson remained clear. Humanity had tried peace first. When peace was rejected, they had shown what humans became when their families were threatened. They had become dragons, and dragons once awakened would never be forgotten. The Zathrian Confederation existed now only as a warning to others. The burned shipyards and destroyed fleet bases served as monuments to the cost of underestimating human resolve. The occupied worlds reminded everyone that humanity would enforce the peace they preferred. The story spread from species to species and world to world. It became part of galactic history and legend. Children across 1,000 worlds heard the tale of the sleeping dragons. Diplomats studied it in their academies. Military officers learned it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of attacking civilian populations. The message was simple and clear. Do not bomb human colonies. Do not murder human civilians. Do not awaken the dragons, because once awakened, the dragons would not rest until their enemies were broken and their people were safe.